as you realise, the last few conversations, the last 4, have been basically on the theme of theology. And this is the penultimate one. Next week we'll be looking at a very practical area in applied theology, I suppose, in the teaching in our schools and teaching our young people and teaching in our parishes. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Bernard Treacy. Bernard is a member of our community and he's our prior. But Bernard came here and is still deeply involved in another ministry which he has been kind of doing since almost his ordination, way back. He's editor of Doctrine and Life and Scripture in Church, and involved in the whole administration of Dominican publications. So that's an area that supplies a need in Ireland for theological conversation and discourse. So Bernard is really kind of well placed to speak in a theology context. As well as that, I suppose, this evening, while the topic is very, very boldly kind of placed, Pope or Council, it's actually a very engaging one at this very time in the Church, because I think we are at a critical juncture. Many people are finding themselves polarized, even around the papacy. And so it's good to have a kind of a perspective on what is happening right now from the point of view of theology and indeed of history. So Bernard, we're very glad to have you speak to us tonight, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you very, very much. And it's a privilege to be here and a privilege to take up this topic. The topic presented itself to me as something to begin thinking about once Pope Francis so hope-buildingly announced his project for bringing the Church on what he called a synodal path. And of course, by that he meant his vision of the whole Church journeying together. But the word synod also means something else. It means a meeting, what in the Western Church would be called a council, in the Eastern Church is called a synod. So it struck me that it could be useful to delve a little into the relationship between synods or councils on the one hand and the papacy on the other, and to have a look at how these two institutions interact. So this presentation will look at 3 matters. First of all, at the various ways in which the papacy has functioned. Then the second will be on the part that councils have played in the life of the Church before the tragic Great Schism of 1054, when East and West separated, and afterwards. And then thirdly, how the two institutions of papacy and collegiality can relate to one another. And on that particular topic, I'll do a little bit of looking at a council of the Church that's not much heeded, the Council of Constance, at the events that led up to it, and at the implications of what happened at that council. So first, a bit of a look at the papacy. And inevitably we think of the papacy in terms of the popes in our own lives. And we've been blessed in our lifetimes by having popes who have had an exemplary commitment to the good of the Church. We mightn't always agree with everything, but we, I think, would agree on that their dedication and their focus has been just wonderful. But have popes always had the same functions? And have they always exercised them in the same way? So I thought that a way of approaching that question might be to ask, who was the first pope? And of course, if you look at the list, people debate, is it St. Peter or is it Linus? But that's not what I'm thinking about at all. Think about if you take the functions that the Pope has at the moment and ask who was the first to exercise those in Rome. And there are three functions. One is being the monarchical bishop in his own diocese. The second function is being a teacher of the faith to the church at large. And then the third function is having the capacity to take administrative action throughout the entire church. So, the first question, the Pope as the single bishop in his own diocese. Well, according to J.N.G. Kelly in the Oxford Dictionary of the Popes, the first in the list of popes who was demonstrably monarchical, he simply held office in his own name, was Pius I, who was Pope, who became Pope in 142. Before that, he is ninth in the list. Before that, leadership among Christians in Rome appears to have been a matter of cooperation between the various houses in which people worshipped. Christian worship was illegal, so they had to meet in people's houses, and there was a coordination between the heads of these houses, and whenever a spokesman was needed, somebody was put forward. So these representatives are listed as popes. But that's what they were, representatives of a collegial gathering. And it's interesting that 100 years after the time of Pope Pius, Rome returned for a while to collegial leadership. And this was because the savage persecution under the Emperor Decius forced them to postpone the election of a pope for a very long time. Come to the question of a pope having a teaching role outside Rome. Who was the first such pope? Well, the evidence pointed to Pope Leo at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. A document he sent to the council. The council made difficulty about receiving it, but when it did receive it, and when it was read aloud, the 500 bishops assembled are recorded as having called out, "This is the faith of the fathers. This is the faith of the apostles. Peter has spoken through Leo." Now we need to be cautious about reading too much into that they were thinking of Leo in the same way as Vatican I thought of Pio IX, but still it is a significant moment. And as to the third function which we see the Pope exercising, of having an administrative outreach throughout the church, evidence for that again comes about the year 340, when you find Pope Julius complaining that he hadn't been consulted in advance about a decision made in Alexandria. And a writer in 343 accepted that the Pope should be the final court of appeal if there are disputes between bishops. And why might this be granted? Well, the principal reason given for Rome having a quasi-supervisory role was that Rome was the place where Peter and Paul had been martyred. Later, only Peter was mentioned. The Council of Candida, interestingly, in 451 declared that the privileges allowed to Rome were granted not for apostolic reasons, or at least apostolic reasons were not mentioned. They were granted because Rome was the imperial city. Now, there was a bit of self-serving in this because the imperial centre had moved from Rome to Constantinople, and Constantinople wanted to be recognised as a patriarch. The Bishop of Constantinople wanted to be recognised as a patriarch, and he claimed it for himself because Constantinople was then New Rome. Therefore, this honour should be granted him. And that was granted, and Andrew, the brother of Peter, was assigned as the patron of Constantinople. Movingly, the day after Pope Francis was inaugurated as Pope, he held a meeting of all those who had come as guests, and Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople was the most senior guest there, and Pope Francis greeted him as, "Welcome to my brother Andrew," which was a touching moment. Mentioning the imperial city reminds us that after Constantine freed Christianity from legal restriction, aspects of the imperial role began to appear in the papacy. And the most obvious one is the use of the term pontiff. That was the title the Roman emperors gave themselves when they were carrying out religious duties for each patron. Being founded by an apostle was not a unique claim for a Christian centre. It could apply also to Antioch, because Antioch was also connected with St. Peter. Jerusalem was associated with James the Apostle, and Alexandria with the evangelist Mark. So by the mid-4th century, the leaders of the churches in Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch and Alexandria were recognized as patriarchs, and the various local churches were gathered around them as the principal leaders. And as we saw later, Constantinople became the 5th patriarchate and the 2nd senior, even though it was such a latecomer. And there were good relations between those patriarchates. We find a beautiful example of that in a letter that Pope St. Gregory the Great wrote about the year 600. This Gregory the Great was a very active pope, sending out missionaries, sending out letters of advice. It was he who sent Augustine, the missionary, to England, who landed in Kent and set up his headquarters in Canterbury. But the Patriarch of Alexandria had written to Gregory, Patriarch of Rome, and had addressed him as universal bishop. And this is part of the reply Gregory sent him. Your beatitude speaks to me, saying, "As you have commanded." I must ask you not to use such words in speaking of me, for I know what I am and what you are. In rank, you are my brother. In manner of life, my father. I have therefore not given orders, but simply done my best to indicate what I think useful. But I have the impression that your beatitude has not taken care to remember what I had hoped to establish in your memory. For I said that you ought not to address me in that fashion. And here at the head of your letter, I found the proud title of Universal Pope, which I have refused. I pray your most beloved holiness not to do it again, because what is exaggeratedly attributed to another is taken away from you. And he ends, my honour is the solid strength of my brothers. Then am I truly honoured when honour is not denied to each one to whom it is due. If your holiness calls me universal Pope, you deny to yourself that which you attribute in a universal sense to me. Let that not be so. Away with those words which inflate vanity and wound charity. Marvellous, isn't it? But such a respectful relationship between the patriarchates was not to last. After decades of rumblings and grumblings and argument, and we could go in, sidetrack into detail, but in 1054, the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated one another. The great tragedy in Christian history. Now, thank God, in 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I lifted those excommunications. But that didn't solve the separation. And the separation is deep and painful and damaging. The tragic separation of the Latin Patriarchate from the Patriarchates of the East left the way open for the powers of the papacy to expand enormously. 500 years after Pope St. Gregory wrote the letter I quoted, another Pope Gregory VII, the great reforming Hildebrand, proclaimed 27 papal prerogatives. I won't go through all of them because some of them are just technical about the appointment of bishops, but some of the more lurid. The Roman Church was founded by the Lord alone. Only the Roman Pontiff, and remember what Pope Gregory I had said, only the Roman Pontiff deserves to be called universal. In a council, his legate can give orders to all bishops, even if he is himself of lower rank. It is forbidden to remain under the same roof as one the Pope has communicated. He alone may, as circumstances require, establish new laws. He alone may use the imperial insignia. The Pope is the only man whose feet all princes are bound to kiss. He may depose emperors. He may at will ordain a cleric of any church. No synod shall be called general except by his instruction. No canonical text exists outside his authority. Proposition number 22. The Roman Church has never erred, and as Scripture shows, can never err. He may depose and absolve bishops outside any synodal assembly. He who is not with the Roman Church is not to be deemed a true believer. And a later pope went further. Boniface VIII decreed, it is absolutely necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. See how far we have moved from Gregory I. and largely possibly because of the tragic separation from the East, with their great instinct for nautical arrangements. And with developments such as that by Hildebrand, the papacy had moved well beyond its original mandate. It was now a major political power in Western Europe, and was competing with kings and princes for influence and power and territory. And it was from that time that we got the term the Lord Pope. The Dominicans here would remember in chapter prayers, the prayers at a meeting of the community up to before 1969. One of the petitions, the prayers were in Latin. One of the petitions was Pro Domino Papa, for the Lord Pope. And it was treating the Pope as, yes, a temporal Lord. And the political duties of the Pope could come into conflict with the Pope's pastoral duties. Just one example maybe. When King Henry VIII was seeking his divorce, the petition he was putting forward, theologians and others thought, had a certain validity to it, and he certainly had constitutional political reasons for it. And the Pope prevaricated for four years. There are draft scenes of decrees granting the petition. But Pope Clement VII lived in Rome, of course, but the Holy Roman Emperor was a nephew, and the favourite nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And his troops had invaded Rome. So, if you were the Lord Pope, as well as your theological, canonical consideration, you also had a political question going on in the back of your mind. Who was it less dangerous to offend? The king of a far-off country, or the emperor whose troops were on your streets? So he favoured the emperor's act. Similarly, was it a 4 or 5 year gap about calling what became the Council of Trent? And that was largely because various rulers wouldn't agree to allow a council in their territories. The Pope was a temporal ruler negotiating with other rulers, and that came in the way of carrying out his pastoral duty. So control of the papacy, which was now a great political power, controlling it became a political ambition, an ambition for the great families of Rome, and an ambition for other kings and princes. Could you control this other great power? And so we had rivalries and politicking. And that brings us to the papacy moving to Avignon. Because for most of the 14th century, the bishops of Rome lived far away from Rome. This came about at the conclave of 1304. It was held in Perugia because Pope Benedict, who was a Dominican, actually, had died there. And the conclave was deadlocked for nearly a year, largely between cardinals who were anxious for reconciliation with France and cardinals who were passionately opposed to France. And Clement V, the Pope who emerged, allowed himself to be crowned in Lyon. and he decided it was better that he would stay in France. And the region around Avignon was part of the Papal States. So he could tell himself that by settling there, he was still fulfilling his duty. And the next 6 popes all lived at Avignon, and they set up efficient administrations there. And the strangeness of the Bishop of Rome living so far from Rome might have been tempered by the fact that for the purpose of conducting political business with all the kings and rulers of Europe, Avignon was much more central and more practical than Rome, which was so far south. And in Rome at that time, life was chaotic. And for the Bishop of Rome to think it was okay to live for so long outside his diocese was also made possible by thinking of the Pope as vicar of Christ, rather than had been customary as representative of St. Peter. Pope Innocent III, yes, the Innocent III who granted Dominic the order of preachers, that Innocent III declared, "We are the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, but we are not his vicar. Not the vicar of any man or even apostle, but the vicar of Jesus Christ himself." And such an exalted view of the papal role would allow the Pope to think that it was all right not to be tied to any one place. The 70-year exile in Avignon came to an end in January 1377 when Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome. Though he was French, he believed that it was the duty of the Bishop of Rome to live in his real diocese. And that move, as we know, was prompted by our own Catherine of Siena, who kept imploring him to return. And in her letters to him, she always addressed him as "my sweetest daddy, dulcissimo babbo mio." Isn't it lovely? And he gave in to her blandishments. But he died just over a year later. And the conclave which followed was mobbed by the Roman crowds. And the conclave, under that pressure, felt they had no choice but to. The Roman crowds feared that a Frenchman would be elected. And the cardinals felt that they had no choice but to choose an Italian. This man took the name Urban VI. He had a good reputation as an administrator. But when he became Pope, he turned out to be so violent and so aggressive and so possibly psychotic that the cardinals regretted their choice. They declared that his election had been conducted under force and was invalid, and they went back into conclave and elected a new Pope. And Clement VII was a native of Geneva, and after all the chaos they had experienced back in Rome, it seemed sensible to him to move back to Avignon. So now you had 2 popes, and the great Western Schism had begun. Now, when you look through the list, you see there are many occasions where there were anti-popes. But this situation was different, because the previous anti-popes were somebody who had been nominated maybe by a powerful family, or by the intervention of a king, or by the intervention of the city authorities in Rome. But this time, the 2 popes had each been elected by the same conclave, the same body of cardinals. And they were not without, each of them was not without credibility as legitimately holding office. And to make things further complicated, they excommunicated each other. So, we now have the Great Western Schism. And it's no surprise that confusion reigned. Some parts of Europe sided with the Roman Pope. Well, obviously, the Papal States would. But so did Corsica, so did Ireland, so did England, the Nordic countries, Poland and Hungary. It's no surprise, of course, that France sided with the Avignon Pope. Neither that Scotland would, because the Scottish crown had, deep ties with the French crown. So did Spain, so did the Kingdom of Naples, and so did Sicily. And then you had the parts of Europe that changed sides from time to time. The Holy Roman Empire was one such. That's modern-day Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. And so did Portugal, move from side to side. And this situation lasted for nearly 40 years, with a double succession of popes, one line based in Rome and the other in Avignon. In 1409, there was an attempt to find a solution. Cardinals on both sides were so scandalized by the situation and by the unwillingness of their principals to seek a solution that they decided to summon a council to be held in Pisa. So that might bring us for a little bit to think about councils in the church. At the beginning of these conversations, Fonsher Ryan's presentation included a memorably rich theological meditation on what is often called the Council at Jerusalem, the incident described in chapter 15 of the Acts of the Apostles, when the first generation of Christians dealt with a major difficulty that had arisen. Should Christians of Gentile background, who had come into the church due to the preaching of Paul and Barnabas, and on one memorable occasion were welcomed by Peter, should they be forced to follow the law of Moses? It was a real question that could have stymied the development of Christianity. And a gathering at Jerusalem to address that matter offers a headline for how to manage inter-church disputes, and you'll find the bulk of the biblical text dealing with that in your handout. The headline you find was that at that meeting there was a deep trust that the Holy Spirit was guiding them. There was open, honest and generous sharing of experience. There was deep listening. There was a real commitment to finding a way forward that would respect all honestly held views. There was no demonizing. And there was commitment to implementing whatever decisions were reached. As disputes arose within the Christian movement, councils and gatherings of that kind were held, but they were held locally. A huge dispute arose about how to interpret how the Word of God can be with the Father and from the Father and equal to the Father, as the Gospels tell us, and how to express that in the language of Greek thinking. There was much discussion, a priest from Alexandria named Arius put forward a view that gained great currency. He held that the Word of God was a creature, but a creature of a vastly higher order even than the angels. And this teaching was quite attractive, but very many resisted it as not expressing their Catholic faith. So there was a lot of disagreement and dispute. And sometimes there were what you might call Orthodox communities and Arian communities side by side. You can see that in the ruins of Ravenna. The Emperor Constantine, when he became a Christian, wanted peace within his territories, and he saw the Orthodox-Arian dispute as imperiling that peace. So he called a meeting of all the bishops of the church to be held in Nicaea in 325. That was the first ecumenical council of the church. And it gave us what we call the Nicene Creed, which we recite at Mass every Sunday. And the recent rewritings of the Nicene Creed are almost like the verbal tussles that went on during that council, concerning the teaching of Arius. So that was the first ecumenical church-wide council. It was called by the emperor and was presided over by the Patriarch of Constantinople. There were another 7 councils held before the great division between East and West. One was at Ephesus, one was at Chalcedon, one was at Nicaea, as we've heard, and there were 4 at Constantinople. They were all convened by the emperor of the day, who was now resident in the East, either by himself or in partnership with the Patriarch of Constantinople. Popes did not attend in person, but they often sent large delegations who had a real and effective part in the deliberations. So there were real church-wide councils of East and West. As mentioned earlier, a document sent by Pope Leo to the council at Chalcedon in 451 had a dramatic effect in focusing their thinking. But councils were not necessarily deferential to popes. In one council, the third one held at Constantinople in 680, condemned as heretical opinions ascribed to a previous pope named Honorius. People have spent academic lifetimes delving into what Honorius really thought, and we're not going to bother. And so all of those first 8 councils, all held before the tragic Great Schism of 1054, are accepted by both East and West as ecumenical and as binding on all Christians. And after the catastrophic division between East and West, popes saw the value of following the example of the apostles and elders as set out in the Acts of the Apostles. And then popes began summoning councils. And the first of these is listed as the 9th General Council, occurred in 1223. Of the 13 councils summoned by popes, 7 were held in Rome, 5 at the Lateran, and as we know, 2 at the Vatican. So we come back to Pisa. And the idea of having a meeting at Pisa to try to solve the problem of having 2 parallel popes was welcomed and the meeting was well attended. It deposed Pope Gregory IX, the Roman Pope, and the Pope Benedict XIII, the Avignon Pope, and elected a new Pope, Alexander V. Sorry for all these details, but they are useful when we come to something. But neither of the deposed popes accepted what had been done. So now the attempt to solve things had only made things vastly worse. You now had 3 popes. One in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. And they all had successors because the thing lasted. As the Shanachie used to say, things rested so. And then in 1414, the successor of the Pope elected at Pisa, succeeded in bringing a council together, that all the groups of cardinals agreed that they really needed to sort out the scandal that the situation was. This Pope's name was John the 23rd. It's interesting that in 1958, when Cardinal Roncalli was elected Pope, Cardinal Roncalli had been a professional historian, took the name John the 23rd. He was clearly signalling that in his reading of things, that Pope, that Pisa Pope, was effectively an anti-Pope. But the council that he called met in Constance in southern Germany. And both for what it was and what it did, this council was an event of most historic significance in the Western Church. In size alone, it was perhaps the most imposing of all medieval representative assemblies. It was far better attended than the Council of Trent. And we can gauge its size from records kept by people responsible for finding accommodation. They list 2 popes attending, John the 23rd and the Pope who emerged from the council, Martin V. 5 patriarchs, 33 cardinals, 47 archbishops, 249 bishops, 247 abbots and priors, 217 doctors of theology, 361 doctors of both laws, and 5,300 simple priests and scholars. And added to them, there were 3,000 merchants, shopkeepers, craftsmen, musicians, and players. So it was one big gathering. And what all these people did when they assembled was that they deposed the Avignon Pope, and they deposed the Pisa Pope, and they allowed the Roman Pope to save face by abdicating. The Roman Pope sulked for a while and held out against the arrangement, but he had little or no support, and his case faded away. And then, with all 3 claimants out of the way, the council devised a special purpose vehicle for filling the office of Pope. They recognised the political factors in the schism by adding to the cardinals, who would ordinarily be the electors. They added to the numbers of cardinals 30 representatives of the council to form a special electoral college. And those 30 representatives were chosen in line with the countries they came from. And this specially designated college of cardinals and of representatives elected Cardinal Odo Colonna, as Pope, and he took the name of Martin V. But the Council of Constance did more than just sort out who held the office of Pope. It handed down teaching. It declared solemnly that councils were the supreme authority in the church. And you find their text in your handout. This Holy Council declares first that it is lawfully assembled in the Holy Spirit. Remember Acts 15 again. That it constitutes a general council representing the Catholic Church, the Church worldwide, and that it therefore has its authority immediately from Christ, and that all men of every rank and condition, including the Pope himself, is bound to obey it in matters concerning the faith, the abolition of the schism, and the reformation of the Church of God in its head and in its members. Secondly, it declares that anyone of any rank and condition who shall contumaciously refuse to obey the orders, decrees, statutes, or instructions made or to be made by this Holy Council or by any other lawfully assembled General Council shall, unless he comes to a right frame of mind, be subjected to fitting penance and punished appropriately. The Council of Constance made this teaching operational by mandating the holding of councils at regular intervals and by setting up a legally binding timetable. The newly elected Pope was instructed to hold a council 2 years after the Council of Constance would have closed. And then 5 years after the close of that council, he was to call another council. And from that point on, councils were legally required to be held at intervals of 10 years. That is the formal teaching of an ecumenical council of the Church. Now, Martin V came from the Colonna family, and they were a Roman family, Joe would know of them, I'm sure, with long expertise in making and breaking popes. And he wasn't at all enamored of ceding papal power to a council, and he dragged his feet. But it was made plain to him that seeing that he owed the papacy, his position as Pope, to a council, he couldn't, with any credibility, fail to do as the council directed. So, there was a long gap, but eventually, in 1431, the council he called at Basel began its deliberations. And the first thing it did was to renew and affirm the decrees of Constance. Now, shortly after Basel started its work, Pope Martin died, and his successor, Pope Eugene IV, was of a mind to disband it. But Cardinal Julian Cesarini, whom Martin had appointed to be president of the council, wrote to Pope Eugene. Whether this council is legitimate depends on the Council of Constance. If that was valid, this is too. No one seems, however, to have doubted its legitimacy and whatever it has decreed. For if one says that the decrees of the council are invalid, one has to say that the deposition of John the 23rd, which was effected by its decrees, was invalid. If this was invalid, the election of Pope Martin was invalid. And if Martin was not Pope, then neither is Your Holiness, who was elected by the cardinals, made by him. No one, therefore, has more interest in defending the decrees of that council than Your Holiness. And if any of the council's decrees are called in doubt, for the same reason could the rest of the decrees be revoked with the same reasoning. The decrees of the other councils are void, since the cause that shakes the faith of one council will make the others doubtful too. Now, the Council of Basel did a lot of detailed work on designing an administrative system that would make having councils at regular intervals an integral part of church life. It also worked on negotiating a rapprochement with the followers of the Bohemian reformer John Huss. If the Council of Constance is remembered at all, it is for condemning Huss and having him burned at the stake. The Council of Basel moved to Florence and then to Ferrara. It took courageous and far-reaching moves in negotiating a resumption of communion with the Greek Orthodox. But the politics of the time were so febrile that this re-engagement didn't last. And what a pity. If there could have been a re-engagement with the Orthodox, conciliarity would have been brought back into the DNA of the church. And sadly, nothing was done to implement the work done at Basel to make a regular sequence of councils part of the life of the church. The memory of Basel and Constance faded, and it had certainly evaporated by 1869-1870, when Vatican II defined papal infallibility. Sorry, Vatican I. Sorry. There was great pressure during Vatican I. Part of it was the French troops around Rome, and they eventually occupied Rome, and the council was cut short. But the greatest pressure came from the Pope who had convoked the council, Pius IX. He wanted a maximalist definition. But that's not what emerged. And you see the definition here in your handout. We, adhering faithfully to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian faith, with a view to the glory of our divine Saviour, the exaltation of the Catholic religion, and the safety of Christian peoples, the Sacred Council, approving, teach and define as a dogma divinely revealed, that the Roman Pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when fulfilling the office of pastor and teacher of all Christians on his supreme apostolical authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the universal church, through the divine assistance promised him in Blessed Peter, is endowed with the infallibility with which the divine Redeemer has willed that his church should be equipped. That was actually a milder version than what the Pope wanted. I think we've gone on a bit long, so I'll move forward a bit. But what is perhaps more impactful on the life of the church than that definition of infallibility is the teaching also handed down by Vatican I, that the Pope has immediate universal jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction alerts us that we're talking law. The one who is the supreme legislator can intervene anywhere in the church and can bypass local structures. Of course, he couldn't possibly do such things by himself. But the existence of this teaching gives to people on his staff an instrument they can use, saying that they are acting in his name. We can understand why other Christian traditions are wary of corporate reunion if this provision remains in place. Popes have recognized this problem. In 1967, Pope Paul VI declared that the papacy is a major obstacle to achieving Christian unity. In his encyclical Ut Unum Sint, John Paul II acknowledged that same truth and called on the other Christian traditions to advise on how the papal office could be more of a servant to unity. And you'll find the text from that encyclical in your handout. Constance may have been forgotten, but the vestiges of conciliarity remain. When Pope Pius XII was preparing to pronounce the doctrine of the Assumption of Our Lady to be held as taught infallibly, he felt obliged to consult all of the bishops of the Catholic Church. He did this by letter, not by a public process, but he did see it as essential to consult. And of course, more importantly, we have all lived through, it's been a great blessing, to live through a conciliar period. We have watched how a council is prepared and conducted and put into effect. And that's not a blessing given to all. Vatican II was 70 years. That's a generation and a half after Vatican I. And you had to go back 300 years from Vatican I to the Council of Trent. So in a way we are living in privileged times to have lived in a conciliar time. When you look at the teaching of Vatican II on the Church, and there's a long extract in your handout, you see an attempt to bring the received teaching on the papacy together with the notion of collegiality. The text doesn't do this very satisfactorily. There's a sense of the two themes being kind of shoehorned together, and more work needs to be done if they are to fit naturally. I'm coming to the end. The title of this conversation was chosen in a way, it's a bit naughty. Council or Pope. We're Catholics, and we don't espouse either or. Our stance must be, if at all possible, both and. And the both and approach is the one we need when relating the Council of Constance with Vatican I. There is a temptation to behave as if Constance never happened. It's more than a temptation. It has occurred. The prestigious Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique simply omitted Constance from its listing of the Church's general councils. Trying to relegate Constance to oblivion would be a mistake, for Constance represents an important strand in Catholic ecclesiology. And if we declare it invalidly summoned and its decrees invalid, then as Cardinal Cesarini insisted to Pope Eugene in 1432, we face ourselves memorably described by Lord Denning as staring down an appalling vista. The appalling vista that if its election of Pope Martin was invalid, the election of every pope since may have been invalid. And as Cardinal Cesarini pointed out, and it's a wonderful irony, the person who has the institution that would have to lose most by repudiating Constance, the Council of Constance, would be the papacy itself. The teaching of Constance on the authority of councils has the same status as the teaching on the papacy handed down by Vatican II. They're both teachings of general councils. We need them both. Pope John Paul famously commented on the need to heal the division between East and West. The Church is healthy only when it breathes with two lungs. Could we not apply the same thinking to the conciliar and the papal aspects of authority in the Church? The church is healthy only when it reads with two lungs. Yes, recognising that the Council of Constance and its essentially constitutionalist provisions are an inherent part of the Catholic tradition, would point us towards re-examining some parts of the absolutist understanding of papal power to which we have been accustomed since Vatican I. Two popes, Paul VI and John Paul II, have shown themselves sympathetic to such a re-examination as part of the vocation to reach forward towards Christian unity, and of course we know the openness of Pope Francis. We need to feel in our hearts a longing for such a development, as is found in the Archic document on authority in the Church, the final text in your handout. And I might just read the last paragraph. If God's will for the unity in love and truth of the whole Christian community is to be fulfilled, this general pattern of the complementarity, primatial and conciliar aspects of episcopae serving the koinonia of the churches needs to be realised at the universal level. The only seat which makes any claim to universal primacy, and which has exercised and still exercises such episcopae, is the See of Rome, the city where Peter and Paul died. It seems appropriate that in any future union, a universal primacy, such as has been described, should be held by that see. When Archic compiled that document, the Anglican co-chairman was Bishop Henry McAdoo, a man who was born in Cork and who grew up at St. Luke's Cross. So, taking on board words drafted by a neighbour might be a good place to stop.
One of the comments that came up here was, that what's happening at the moment, what happened to the bishops in South America, the Amazon,
Yes.
what's happening now last week in Germany, in Luxembourg, that's an actual fact. Have we moved on very quickly now that bishops and cardinals are making statements that are not universally accepted, but are accepted in their pastoral? It's a reality that they're people. So without sounding kind of disobedient or adolescent, has something broken? Is there something broken now, do you think, that expression is showing itself?
Isn't it possible that there's a need actually to recognise new patriarchates? That the Amazon is a region with its own needs, and that it should be able to provide for those needs without very heavy central supervision.
That would fit in very well with this whole business that the Church keeps emphasising in its social teaching of the principle of subsidiarity.
Exactly.
You don't impose from the top. It can be done much more efficiently from below,
Yes. Yeah.
So you leave them as much freedom to kind of work out their own kind of needs and so on, instead of just kind of handing on ready-made solutions all the time, or even refusing to give them any solution.
Yes.
And might it not be helpful for dialogue within the church as a whole if the local hierarchy, as well as articulating for its own lay members, local lay members, the message from Rome, that they should also articulate in the other direction, that they should express the message that they're getting from their own faithful to the wider world and towards, you know.
Isn't that, I mean, you're of the same mind as Pope Francis. Isn't that the process he is trying to put in place now? That conversations in parishes will feed into dioceses, will feed into national assemblies, and then will feed into a meeting in Rome. But it's absolutely so here.
And does it happen? I mean, does it, how do I say,
It's,
is it effective?
that's what we're not fully sure. I mean, it's supposed to be underway, but I haven't seen timetables for meetings. The Irish situation is slightly complicated because the Irish bishops have themselves set up a consultation of that kind, and it was starting, and then Pope Francis came. So, you know,
why did they stop it?
Pardon?
I wonder why they wouldn't stop it for that reason.
I'm not sure what's going on, which process is the one that is being driven. I'm not sure. Or,
Wouldn't that kind of bear out almost what you're saying, like, you know, that the bishops are so beholden to getting the impetus from Rome
yes.
that they're not going to do anything until they get it. Which is
But
part
they
of-
actually had started something.
I know,
Yeah.
should have, but, yeah.
And what was the experience in Limerick? You know, Limerick had a synod of their own a few years ago.
Yes.
When Brandon came
But that's right, yeah. And Fitzgibbon, Father
Yeah,
Fitzgibbon was a big
Yeah.
force in it.
Or what would be the outcome of that?
I don't know.
There's a certain weakness in it coming from the top down. If this kind of demand for synod was coming up from the people and being heard and being
Yes.
articulated, it'd be much more likely to succeed than if they're kind of handing it down, do this, and we'll sort it out when you're finished.
Yeah.
There's an awful, I think it's an awful danger that the synod will listen to the people and come up with ideas and so on, but then on the process upwards, it'll be refined so that the actual message that will get to the top in the end might have little or nothing to do with the underlying message that the people were trying to articulate.
Okay.
Would it not be a good thing to make people feel loved and feel good instead of making them feel guilty? Because a lot of people just, I think they don't feel worthy and they need to feel loved. And I heard a man here, you may remember the man who used to do the mass, peace mass at St. Francis Church. He was a Jewish man and became a Christian. And he said, like, the Jewish people will change only when they're made to feel loved. And I think that goes for a lot of Catholics and Christians, all denominations in fact, that they need to be told that God has died for them, God does love them. And instead of, they feel guilty and then they feel unworthy. And I'm sure those people who don't go to communion are the most worthy people in the world because they're so humble, they feel they're not worthy. And a friend of mine died in the Mercy Hospital many years ago, and he said, Mel, it's when you're in mortal sin you need God most.
I like that.
And he was dying. And it was a lovely man, a wonderful man. So I think we should all go out and tell everybody.
I wonder sometimes that the infallible dimension of papal authority is lurking there in the background all the time. So that when the Pope makes a statement, an authority statement, they think that this is an infallible one, or the fact that he says this is very important about this. But like, it's not necessarily infallible. And if his statement is just an authoritative one, it is possibly an expert opinion, but it can be wrong. And that aspect, that dimension of papal authority, I think has to be looked at. And it's, as far as I can make out, that there were only two infallible statements ever made by the Pope, the two Marian ones. But like in terms of what was being said by popes and like day after day, year after year after year, could well be, sometimes we've seen the mistakes they made and the change. And but like it's just authority, their authority, there's an authority, but that's open to be questioned. So there's nothing blocking people to try various possibilities to do things the Amazon and so on. It is a perfect right to do that.
There's actually a section there that I left out which touches on that, in that during Vatican I, where Pio IX wanted this maximalist thing, the first draft said concerning the infallibility of the Pope. So it was going to exactly to say in the sense that it's something that is attached to his person. And the Archbishop of Bologna, who was a Dominican, and who was known to be in favour of some definition, but he stood up and requested that that be rephrased. The infallibility of teachings, not of the person. And he gave quite an explicit account that we mustn't turn the Pope into an oracle. He was embraced afterwards by those who were opposed to the death definition, and they got a thunderous pressing down from Pio IX.
Who was that? Was Squillace? Was that his name? No?
No, Cecchi, I think. Yeah.
I think it was a very unfortunate word. I think that whole debate and the fact that that council was not finished until Vatican II. And Vatican II more or less rolled back almost as far as it could.
Well, when you read, maybe I should have done something different and I should have just gone through that text. A lot of the language of Vatican I about the Pope, about being directly responsible to Christ and that's in Lumen Gentium, but with teaching also about collegiality. But it is imported. And I suspect a lot more work needs to be done.
It would be a brave Pope now that would say, what I'm teaching now is infallible.
Well,
Really would.
well, it's kind of open, you know, that John Paul II wanted that his teaching against women priests would be held as infallible, and that Joseph Ratzinger, remember Joseph Ratzinger wrote a letter saying that the teaching on this was infallible, and then Ratzinger made a fool of him. Ratzinger knew the horrible damage that would be done if a formal definition had gone through, and he persuaded JP2 that, look, I'll take the flak and I'll do it, and he made a fool of himself to save the church from a greater problem. Because you can't do an infallible thing to have one of your staff write a letter in his own name, you know. And Ratzinger knew that, but he also knew that if what the Pope was planning had happened,
So who thinks the Holy Spirit is behind all this change? I think really.
but I do think that's one of the moments where Joseph Ratzinger was a kind of a hero. Because anybody who knew any theology knew that the letter was stupid. And the man who wrote it was not.
Yeah.
That's a most peculiar statement.
Pardon?
That's a most peculiar statement, that the letter was stupid, but the man who wrote it was not.
Yeah.
Like, I come across that now with the anti-vaxxers. It's like, when you make these statements that are off the wall,
Yeah.
I look at the person and I say, you must be off the wall too, but you can't say that. But I don't know where to put them.
Yeah.
When something so stupid is put out, and yet the man or the person is an intelligent person, what do you do with him?
Well, in this particular case, it was an intelligent person kind of making himself look foolish, because if he allowed the other development to happen, it would be a greater damage.
And how did his, I don't see clearly, how did his letter prevent the other development happening?
Because JP2 accepted that a letter would be
Would suffice.
enough. Yeah.
Do you think that, I was saying this with the black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, and so forth, you know, that it's almost to use an endless phrase, that the Spirit of God is shouting it
Yes.
at us, you know.
Yes.
And I know institutions move slowly and it takes a long time to change them. But in a way, we are doing it to one extent the best of times, because people, I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but people aren't waiting for top down. People are finding, you know, the Word of God, reflecting the Word of God, reflecting their situation, and putting both together. And so this is our life, you know. I can remind you, Francis, one of his first visits to South America, the Pope, he was told to keep quiet. He met all the leaders of the basic communities, and when he spoke, a young man got up to thank him and said, "Your words are very good, and we thank you for coming and saying what you said. However, you must remember that the Church has spoken for the poor down the centuries. You've never let us speak. You've never listened to our voice, you know. So the time has come for you now to keep quiet, Pope Francis, and please listen to us." So the following day, Francis actually got up and said, "How many texts I've prepared in the letter yesterday, I will just sit and listen now." But it's a very powerful gesture
Yes.
on the part of the leader of the basic communities and on Francis.
Yeah.
Because it has dawned to me, there's a truism that beautiful documents, you know, Popular Progressio and Reverend Baron, they're good, they're radical, but they're very top down.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this man was saying, no, it's time for us. You can listen to us. So in a sense, that's happening globally. Even though it interests in ecology and the environment, you know, there's something beautiful and positive is being born in front of us, really. That we needn't feel threatened by black theology or gay theology or women's theology. We needn't be threatened by that, you know. And so it's a pity when you read statements where liberation theology was shut down, you know. It's sad.
Yes.
Because we go back to, well, is this or not from the Spirit of God? And if it is, then what are we doing as an institution?
Yeah.
And also, finally, there's something undignified by telling people, you don't know what you're talking about, but we know it.
Yes.
Do not be afraid.
Indeed. And maybe also, I know it's a smaller church, but the Anglican Church and their model of synods and their various houses, and you know, I'm not saying it's perfect, but
It's very profile. Now, it doesn't do much. I mean, it is strongly parliamentary.
yes.
I worry about the young people when I hear that they have all this mental health and mental traumas they're going through. And I think it's just basic teaching of love of God for them. That they're not getting it in their homes because the parents are out working all day. I was fortunate enough, I suppose, to stay at home with mine. as a mother, I didn't go to work. I decided to pack up work and stay with them. But I still see that they've grown up with ideas of their own, and when I try to talk to them, they say, Mom, it's hard enough to live in this world and pay the rents and pay all things like that. So it's the world itself that's drawing them away. You know, that it's tough. It's very tough for young people out there. And I see a great deal of love in the people themselves, but it's the living and trying to live up to standards and things like that. It's just very difficult. And that's pulling them away. So we want to get our politicians involved as well.
I think what Bernard said at the end there, like, you know, that we're living in a very kind of fortunate time, that we've experienced in our lifetime the great shift of the Second Vatican Council and all the kind of, you know, the ripples coming out of that. And probably what we're experiencing is the kind of the pain of change, and it's happening in spite of us, you know. It's not going to happen from Pope Francis. He's just trying to say, change where you are, you know, with the Synod and that. So maybe that's the kind of the positive thing, like, you know, when you're talking the...
And the kind of suffering as well.
Oh, yeah.
And suffering is very positive about country.
Is there any hopes or thoughts or that there might be another council, you know, is that an aspiration down the road, or I'm not saying there's a time scale or anything like, but, you know,
Maybe that's part of what Pope Francis is doing. I mean, he's trying to set up a kind of rolling process of conversation. Like, at Vatican II, there were 2,900 bishops. There's now about 5,900 bishops, isn't it? Now, you can, I don't know how many you have at the UN General Assembly meeting, but I mean, it's a very unwieldy undertaking. So the alternative might be that what Francis is doing is to have these kind of rolling meetings, and also to have greater autonomy locally.
Bernard, was there ever any kind of direct repudiation of the council?
Of Constance? Not that I know of, no.
Is it just
They wouldn't dare.
just brush it under the carpet?
Yeah. Well, as Caroline Chase really said, and it's the big irony that the council, with this uncompromising teaching of councils being the supreme authority, the irony is that the institution which would lose most if that were to be repudiated completely would be the papacy.
Just sorting out the whole
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah. And I like that.
I always thought it was heretical myself, you know, but that's what we were brought up to thinking.
Yes, yeah.
The whole thing about conciliarism was a heresy rather than a...
Well, if it was a heresy, the Eastern Church has always been a heresy.
I always worried about it. I was terrified of that word as a child. I never knew the meaning of it. I think I asked Father one night, what's the meaning of the word heresy? And I read up then, and it just means that somebody who won't conform. And you know, Jesus didn't conform to the Jewish religion himself. He didn't. So that, you know, to me it's obscene.
There's a great story about an Irish-born, an Irish Dominican, a member of the English province who died in the 1940s, Vincent McMahon, you know, who was it? But a story about him at a examination in theology, and he was asked to give a definition of heresy, and the answer he gave was dogma in the making.
But I suspect he wasn't very favourable even to dogma, you know.
No,
He was still back, you know. Never know.
And
It's Belfast now.
Pardon?
It's Belfast. He's Irish.
Newcastle County Down.
I think, sorry, Brian. I think we're coming to 9:15, so maybe people will be anxious to get home. I think what Bernard has given us a very, very carefully worked out paper this evening, so I want to thank you for that, Bernard. And I really, it brought home to me, and I'm sure to us, the value of having a historical perspective on anything. You know? And that sometimes when we lose that sense of history, we're kind of in some kind of absolute place. So thank you for bringing us into that. And I think there's maybe a few talks in what you have there, you know, with the but just sorry, Stephen.
Okay, so for next week, two things. In a way, continuing a very topic at the moment. If you read the Irish Times left column in the past few weeks, there's a debate about governance of schools, sort of Catholic schools, Catholic education. So we've invited Gerard Condon. Gerard is class inspector at the Diocese of Cloyne, Irish Priest in Killavogin, fellow student, my own. Gerard will look at the question of is it the school is the place for faith formation for young people, or is it the worshipping community? Is it in the church or the pew? So Gerard will lead us in that conversation next week. This evening, I want to extend sympathy of ourselves and this group to Imelda, whose husband died recently. So Imelda, to be assured of our prayers and our support for you and for your family this time. Remember your husband.
appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
So glory be to the Father.
And to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
Bernard, also some flyers up there for the committee and publications. There's
Yes,
flyers.
And flowers from
we prepare some for
last
your,
2 weeks.
isn't there a geography for your sisters and your cousins and